Colorado Territory, 1872. The last autumn leaves clung desperately to cottonwoods along the banks of Bear Creek, where Garrett Zimmerman's modest ranch house stood as the only human structure for miles. At 26, Garrett had already spent more years alone than most men twice his age, his hands calloused from work, his eyes bright with youth but shadowed by loss. The two-room cabin and 40 acres represented everything he'd managed to build after the war took his father and brother, leaving behind nothing but debts and a teenage boy with an impossible dream. A man's only purpose out here is surviving, he told his horse as they moved cattle toward winter pasture. The moment you start needing people is the moment you invite disappointment. The cold wind carried his words away, as if even nature rejected such a notion. His ranch hands, seasonal workers he kept at arm's length, had departed weeks ago for Denver, leaving him properly alone for the winter, just as he preferred it. But the peculiar emptiness in his chest had grown larger with each passing year. At night, when the oil lamp cast long shadows across rough-hewn walls, Garrett sometimes caught himself staring at the empty chair across the table, imagining someone there. It was weakness, he told himself. The frontier punished weakness. That afternoon, as he secured the last gate on the northern pasture, the distant rattle of wagon wheels drew his attention. Travelers were rare this late in the season, when the mountain passes could close at any moment. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip as he guided his sorrel gelding toward the road. The approaching wagon came into view, a weathered farm wagon with a single horse pulling it, its contents covered by a worn canvas. The driver, to Garrett's surprise, was a young woman. She sat rigidly on the seat, her back straight despite what must have been days of uncomfortable travel. As she approached, he could see she was desperately fighting to control the exhausted horse that pulled her meager possessions. "Whoa there," Garrett called, riding closer. "You're pushing that animal too hard for this terrain." The woman pulled back on the reins, and the horse gratefully slowed. Her face, partially hidden beneath a plain bonnet, turned toward him. When she lifted her gaze, Garrett felt an unexpected jolt. Her eyes were the deep blue of mountain lakes, set in a face whose beauty remained evident despite the trail dust and exhaustion. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey blonde hair escaping from beneath her bonnet, and wearing a faded blue dress that had once been fine but now showed the wear of hard travel. "I'm looking for the Zimmerman Ranch," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. Garrett straightened in his saddle. "You're looking at the owner, Garrett Zimmerman." Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by apprehension. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I've come from Tennessee." She hesitated. I'm here about your advertisement." Confusion crossed Garrett's face before understanding dawned. The mail-order bride advertisement. He'd placed it 6 months ago during a moment of weakness, a moment of loneliness so profound he'd written to an agency back east. But he'd convinced himself no one would respond, or if they did, he would simply ignore it. The frontier was no place for a woman raised in civilization, and his life had no room for another person to worry about, to eventually lose. "Miss Whitfield," he said stiffly, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. That advertisement was a mistake." Eleanor's face fell, but she quickly recovered, squaring her shoulders. "I've traveled over 1,000 miles, Mr. Zimmerman. I sold everything I had to get here. I'm sorry for your trouble, but the war took everything from us," she interrupted, a flash of steel appearing beneath her exhaustion. "Our home, our livelihood. My father and brothers never returned from Shiloh. My mother passed last spring. I have no one left, nothing but the items in this wagon." Garrett felt her words like a physical blow. They mirrored his own losses too closely. "I didn't come expecting paradise," Eleanor continued. "Your letter spoke of hard work and solitude. It spoke honestly of a life built from nothing. That's all I'm asking for, a chance to build something." Her voice softened. "I arrived with nothing but hope, Mr. Zimmerman." Something shifted in Garrett's chest, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. "Miss Whitfield, hope doesn't feed cattle through blizzards or fix broken fences." A faint smile touched her lips. "Perhaps not, but it's what gets you up to do those things day after day." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow. Garrett looked toward the mountains, where dark clouds were gathering. The first winter storm would hit within days. "You can stay until spring," he finally said. "It's too dangerous to send you back now. When the pass is clear, we'll arrange your return." Relief flooded her features. Thank you. The nearest town is 2 days' ride. There's no church, no society. Just work and silence, he warned. Eleanor nodded. I understand. As he helped her guide the wagon toward his cabin, Garrett told himself this arrangement was temporary. Come spring, she would realize the frontier wasn't for her. He would be alone again, as he should be, as was safest. But as Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, her eyes taking in the modest cabin with something like appreciation rather than disappointment, Garrett felt that crack in his walls widen just a fraction more. That's all we need to start, he found himself saying, nodding toward the cabin. It isn't much, but it keeps the snow out. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and did strange things to Garrett's resolve. Then it's more than enough. The storm arrived sooner than expected, howling down from the mountains with a fury that rattled the cabin windows. Eleanor had taken the small bedroom, while Garrett made his bed near the fireplace. On that first night, as wind screamed across the valley, Garrett lay awake, acutely aware of the other person under his roof, just beyond the door. In the morning, he found Eleanor already awake, tending the fire with practiced ease. I hope I didn't wake you, she said. On our farm, early rising was necessary. You know farm work? He asked, unable to hide his surprise. Since I was old enough to walk. We had 60 acres before the war. There was no self-pity in her voice, only matter-of-fact acknowledgement. Over the following weeks, as snow blanketed the landscape, Garrett maintained his distance, expecting Eleanor's enthusiasm to falter, waiting for complaints that never came. Instead, she threw herself into work, mending clothes he'd neglected, organizing his chaotic kitchen stores, cooking meals that made his own attempts seem pitiful. One evening, as they sat on opposite sides of the table eating a stew Eleanor had prepared, Garrett caught himself staring at her hands, delicate but strong, bearing small calluses and cuts from her work. You don't have to prove yourself, he said suddenly. Eleanor looked up, surprise crossing her features. I'm not trying to prove anything. This is simply what needs doing. Most women would have been crying to return to civilization by now. A small, sad smile touched her lips. What civilization would that be, Mr. Zimmerman? The one that took our men to war and left women to rebuild from ashes? The one where a woman alone has few respectable options? She set down her spoon. I didn't come west running from something. I came looking for something. And what was that? He asked despite himself. A place where what you build matters more than what you've lost. Her words hung in the air between them. For the first time since she arrived, Garrett truly looked at Eleanor, not as an unwanted complication or a temporary burden, but as someone who might understand the weight he carried. December brought heavier snows. When one of the pregnant heifers went missing, Garrett spent hours tracking her through drifts, only to find her struggling in a ravine. By the time he guided the animal back to the barn, night had fallen and the temperature had plummeted. His fingers were numb, his clothes soaked through with sweat and melted snow. Eleanor was waiting with lantern light guiding him home. She helped him with the heifer, working alongside him without being asked, anticipating what needed to be done. When they finally stumbled back into the cabin, Garrett's teeth were chattering uncontrollably. You need to get warm, she said, practical and firm. She built up the fire while he changed behind a screen into dry clothes, then pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands. Thank you, he managed, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he'd thanked anyone for anything? That heifer means a great deal to you, she observed, sitting across from him. Every animal counts. One loss can start a slide that's hard to stop out here. Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. On our farm, after my brothers left, I helped deliver twin calves during the worst storm of the year. My mother said I had a gift. A shadow passed over her face. We lost the farm anyway. I'm sorry, Garrett said, and meant it. What happened to your family? She asked gently. Normally, such a question would have been met with stony silence. But something about her presence, the shared understanding of loss, perhaps, loosened his tongue. My father and brother joined the Union Army. Neither came home. My mother had already passed years before from fever. He stared into the fire. I was 17 when I came out here. Had just enough money to make a down payment on this land. You built all this yourself, she said, looking around the cabin with new appreciation. Had to. There wasn't anyone else to do it. There isn't always someone else, Eleanor agreed softly. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be. Their eyes met across the table, and for a brief moment, Garrett allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to not carry everything alone. The thought terrified him. Christmas arrived with another blizzard. Garrett had planned to ignore the holiday as he usually did, but on Christmas Eve, he returned from checking the cattle to find Eleanor had decorated the cabin with pine boughs and red berries. The simple gesture transformed the utilitarian space into something that felt, impossibly, like a home. "I hope you don't mind," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "I found the berries along the creek before the snow." "I don't mind," he said, surprised to discover it was true. That night, Eleanor produced 2 small packages wrapped in cloth. "I didn't get you anything," Garrett said, embarrassed. "You gave me shelter from the winter. That's gift enough." She pushed one package toward him. "It isn't much." Inside was a pair of leather gloves, his old ones having been patched beyond repair. The stitching was meticulous, the leather soft but sturdy. "I salvaged the leather from an old saddlebag," she explained. "I noticed your others were worn through." Garrett ran his fingers over the careful stitching. "No one's given me a gift in years." The second package contained a small cake made with precious dried fruit she must have been saving since her arrival. They shared it by firelight, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Garrett felt the cabin's silence transformed from empty to peaceful. As January's brutal cold settled over the ranch, the routine they established began to feel less like an awkward accommodation and more like a partnership. Eleanor proved herself capable with the chickens and smaller livestock, allowing Garrett to focus on the cattle and more distant parts of the property. One evening, returning from checking fence lines, Garrett approached the cabin to find Eleanor outside, struggling with an armload of firewood. As he dismounted to help, his horse's sudden movement startled her. She slipped on ice, the wood scattering as she fell hard. Garrett was at her side instantly. "Are you hurt?" She winced as she tried to stand. "My ankle." He helped her inside, easing her onto a chair to examine her injury. Her ankle was already swelling. Their eyes met as his fingers gently probed the joint, and Garrett became acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment, the first time he had touched her beyond helping her from a wagon or passing a dish at dinner. "It's not broken," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "But you shouldn't walk on it for a few days." Eleanor nodded, then attempted to rise. "The firewood, I'll get it," Garrett said, guiding her back down. "You need to rest." Over the next few days, with Eleanor confined to the cabin, Garrett found himself hurrying through outside chores to return to her company. The silent meals they'd shared for weeks gave way to conversations that stretched into the evening. Eleanor told him about her life in Tennessee, not just the hardships, but moments of joy, apple harvests and barn dances, her mother's garden, her father's fiddle playing. In return, Garrett found himself sharing stories he'd told no one. About his father teaching him to track, his brother's terrible singing, the dream that had driven him west when everyone said he was too young. "Sometimes I still feel like that boy," he admitted one night as they sat before the fire, Eleanor mending a shirt while he cleaned his rifle. And over his head, pretending to know what he's doing. "I think everyone feels that way," she said. "We just get better at hiding it." He looked up from his work. "Not you. You always seem certain." A soft laugh escaped her. "Oh, Garrett." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something warm spread through his chest at the sound of it. "I was terrified every mile of the journey here. I'm terrified most days still. You never show it. Neither do you." Her eyes met his, gentle but perceptive. "Being afraid doesn't make you weak. Pretending you never need anyone, that's what might break you in the end." Her words hit too close to the fear he'd carried since losing his family, that letting anyone matter meant inevitably facing that loss again. "Some things are worth the risk," she added softly, as if reading his thoughts. That night, lying before the fire, Garrett found himself unable to sleep, Eleanor's words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future different from the solitary existence he'd planned, one where the second chair at his table was always filled, where the silence of evening was broken by conversation, where the burden of the ranch was shared. The thought no longer terrified him quite as much as it once had. February brought a brief thaw. As Eleanor's ankle healed, they ventured outside together to check the nearest pastures. Garrett found himself noticing things he'd overlooked for years, the way sunlight sparkled on snow, the tracks of rabbits and foxes creating stories across the white expanse, the particular blue of the winter sky that somehow matched Eleanor's eyes. When a letter arrived from town via a passing trader, Eleanor's face fell as she read it. "Bad news?" Garrett asked. "The agency," she said quietly. "They want to know if our arrangement is proceeding or if I'll need placement elsewhere come spring." The question hung between them. Their temporary arrangement suddenly required definition. "What will you tell them?" he asked. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. "That depends on what you want, Garrett." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. But before Garrett could answer, the trader who delivered the letter interrupted with news that froze his blood. Rustlers had been working the area, hitting isolated ranches during the winter months when help was scarce. "Took the Andersons' entire herd last week," the man said. "Burned their barn for good measure." That night, after the trader departed, a new tension filled the cabin. Garrett cleaned his Winchester repeatedly, checking and rechecking ammunition. "You're worried," Eleanor observed. "My cattle are everything I have," he said. "Without them, there's no ranch, no future. What can I do to help?" The simple question, offered without hesitation, caught him off guard. For years, his instinct had been to handle threats alone, to push away help. "You know how to shoot?" he asked instead. Eleanor nodded. "My father made sure of it before he left for war." That night, Garrett moved his bedroll closer to the door, his rifle within arm's reach. He lay awake for hours, listening to the wind, to the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers, to Eleanor's soft breathing from the bedroom. The thought of danger touching her, this woman who had arrived with nothing but hope and somehow begun rebuilding what he thought was permanently broken within him, was unbearable. The attack came 3 days later. Garrett was checking the western fence line when he spotted smoke rising from the direction of the cabin. He spurred his horse into a gallop, heart pounding, a single thought dominating his mind: Eleanor. As he crested the rise, he saw 3 men on horseback circling the cabin. Relief flooded him when a rifle shot rang out from the cabin window. Eleanor was alive and fighting back. Drawing his revolver, Garrett fired a warning shot that scattered the attackers momentarily. 1 broke away, heading for the cattle pasture, while 2 turned toward him. The ensuing gunfight was brief but violent. Garrett took a bullet to his arm, but managed to drive off the 2 rustlers. Bleeding and desperate, he rode for the cabin, where Eleanor emerged with his Winchester, her face streaked with soot but determination in her eyes. "The third man," she began. "The cattle," Garrett gasped, clutching his wounded arm. Together they rode toward the pasture, where they found the 3rd rustler attempting to drive a portion of the herd through a cut fence. Eleanor proved herself an excellent shot, winging the man in the shoulder and sending him fleeing without the cattle. Back at the cabin, which the rustlers had attempted to burn before Eleanor extinguished the flames, she tended Garrett's wound with steady hands. "You could have been killed," he said as she finished bandaging his arm. "So could you," she replied simply. "But neither of us was. We protected what's ours." The word ours hung between them. Garrett reached up with his good hand to brush a smudge of ash from her cheek. "I thought I might lose you," he admitted, the words coming from some deep place he'd kept locked for years. Eleanor's hand stilled on the bandage. "I'm not so easily lost, Garrett Zimmerman." "When I saw the smoke, I realized." He broke off, struggling to articulate the revelation that had struck him during his desperate ride home. "I've been telling myself that not needing anyone keeps me safe. But today I realized that what I fear most isn't dying out here alone. It's losing you." Eleanor's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want you to go in spring. I don't want to tell that agency anything except that you're where you belong. If you want to be." "Where I belong," she repeated softly. "And where is that?" "Here," Garrett said, finding courage he didn't know he possessed. "With me, building something together that's stronger than what either of us could build alone." Eleanor's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face despite the smudges of ash and the exhaustion of battle. "I'd like that very much." Impulsively, Garrett leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch that deepened when she responded. When they finally parted, something fundamental had shifted between them, as if the last barrier had finally fallen. "I should warn you," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm not very good at needing people. I'm out of practice." Eleanor laughed softly. "We have time to practice together." The rustlers' attack brought unexpected consequences. Word spread through the territory about how the Zimmerman ranch had fought off the gang that had been terrorizing isolated homesteads. Neighbors Garrett barely knew rode in to check on them, offering help with repairs and additional security. To his surprise, Garrett found himself accepting their assistance and offering his own in return. The web of connections Eleanor had been quietly building since her arrival, with the trader who brought mail, with the rancher's wife 10 miles east who shared preserved fruit, with the blacksmith who passed by occasionally, suddenly became visible to him. "You've been creating community while I wasn't looking," he observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the lengthening days of March bring the first hints of green to the valley. Eleanor smiled. "The frontier isn't meant to be faced alone. That's why settlers form towns, why ranchers help each other during Roundup. I thought needing no one made me strong. And now—" Garrett took her hand, still marveling that he could do so freely. "Now I think strength is knowing when to stand together." As winter released its grip, Garrett rode into town with a specific purpose. He returned with a simple gold band that had cost him more than he'd ever spent on anything that wasn't for the ranch. That evening, as the first wildflowers began dotting the meadows, he knelt before Eleanor beside Bear Creek, where they'd walked to watch the sunset. "I don't have much to offer except hard work and land that's still more promise than profit," he said, holding out the ring. "But everything I have, everything I am, is yours if you want it, Eleanor Whitfield. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. They were married in April by a circuit preacher who happened through, with half a dozen neighboring families as witnesses. Eleanor wore a dress she'd remade from her finest remaining fabric, with wildflowers in her hair. Garrett wore the only suit he owned, purchased years ago and never worn. As they spoke their vows beneath the cottonwoods by the creek, Garrett found himself reflecting on how completely his understanding of life had transformed in the months since Eleanor had arrived. What he had once seen as weakness, needing others, letting them matter, he now recognized as the greatest strength he possessed. That autumn, as they prepared for their first winter as husband and wife, the ranch looked different than it had a year before. The cabin had a new room added on, built with the help of neighbors during a barn raising that turned into a celebration. The cattle herd was larger, healthier under their combined care. A small vegetable garden flourished behind the house, and Eleanor had planted fruit trees that would someday bear. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Eleanor rested her head against Garrett's shoulder, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach, where their first child grew. "Are you happy?" Garrett asked softly. Eleanor smiled up at him. "More than I ever thought possible. When you arrived, you said you came with nothing but hope," Garrett remembered. "I told you that was all we needed to start. And I'd say we've done more than just start," Eleanor replied, looking out at their land. "No longer just a ranch, but a home. We've built something that will last." As darkness settled over the valley, they remained together on the porch, surrounded by the life they'd created from nothing but hope and the courage to believe that love, even on the harsh frontier, was worth the risk of loss. The ranch lights glowed warmly, a beacon in the gathering darkness, promising shelter to any who might need it, so different from the lonely outpost it had once been. For Garrett Zimmerman, who had once believed that the frontier was no place for love, the truth had revealed itself in Eleanor's steadfast presence. The frontier was precisely where love mattered most, transforming mere survival into a life worth living, turning solitude into family, and proving that what is built together can withstand even the harshest storms.